Good to see you. Thanks for being here. Um, I'm going to talk today somewhat briefly about the adaptive management update that's happening with Atlas. I think many of you know that Atlas is the strategic prioritization for habitat projects in the Upper Grand Ronde, Catherine Creek, and then also the Wallowa. Um, the effort that I've been working on with the model watershed has been focused on Upper Grand Ronde and Catherine Creek. Um, it's easy to get into the minutia with Atlas, and I'm going to try to resist that urge today. I think it's important to. Here we go. Yeah. Um, it's important to recognize what Atlas is, which is really cool. It's basically a structure that allows us to get together and have fundamental conversations about where to work and what to do in the watershed. Obviously, we spend a lot of money. We invest a lot in our streams, and we want to make sure that those investments are going to pay off. But Atlas is great because it's an opportunity for partners to get together, share science, um, share understanding, and chart a course for the future. So, if I get into the weeds, just remember that opportunity that we have. So Atlas was, as many of you know, was created in 2015-ish, and it's been in place and being used quite a bit since that time. And the work we've been doing is to do like a 10-year review and update. Um, so far, that process has been fairly um, restricted to a small group of us, and that's been my team. And then we've been working with GRMW and Kramer Fish Sciences and BPA to say, like, where do we need to make updates? Where do we think the big decisions are? And we're just trying to kind of prime the pump for what's coming next, which is the technical advisory committee process. That's represented by the green arrow, or the second arrow on the figure. Uh, that that process is about to get started, and that will involve a series of 6 or so meetings with the TAC to really work through and update the details of Atlas. Now, I don't want to say we're going to update the framework. We're gonna try to be strategic, but we also have tried not to get too far ahead of the partners and the TAC. And so, if I didn't say it, it's a really collaborative prioritization process, and so we really want to maintain that objective. Just looking back, Atlas has this kind of formation where there's science and implementation partners that sit in a room and work through the structured scoring process, and those conversations that inform the scoring, and ultimately the prioritization is informed by science. In some places, science and data ingest directly into the thing, but in most cases, the data routes through the people, and then the people make the decisions about the scoring. So that happened with a lot of really smart people about 10 years ago. And the original objectives, they may have evolved somewhat from this, but this is an old slide. It's really about being strategic, being accountable, bringing people together, consolidating best available science, and using all the data and information that is out there. Just a few basics. Many of you probably know this, but Atlas is formed on sort of two scales: biologically significant reaches, which are the sub-watersheds. Those are really used to prioritize where to work. And then we have opportunities, which are project scale polygons on the ground, that represent potential opportunities. Those can also be scored and ranked. That has been done less. Generally, Atlas has been used more at the BSR level to date. Here's the general process that was undertaken. Basically, there was an assembly of data, there was a defining of these subwatersheds, scoring of those subwatersheds, and then kind of the same process for the opportunities, mapping the opportunities, scoring, and then they've fed into or the model watersheds database. And of course, Atlas then informs the stepwise funding process. Okay, so now getting into a little bit more of the review. Of course, if you review something, you want to know that it's still fit for use going forward. And the reality is that Atlas is really the state of the art for prioritization frameworks in the Columbia River Basin. And that's not just me saying it. There have been a series of reviews, and this one in particular by the Tributary Technical Team, which has a bunch of uh, PhD scientists and stuff. Uh, Says it's well organized, it's process or science based. It uses a variety of biological and physical criteria. It can be fine tuned, so it's effectively we're adaptively managing the thing right now. It involves people, and the terms on my screen are getting. Oh yeah, vernacular knowledge, best available science. You get it. The point is, it's useful, and we're going to keep using it. At least that's the plan, as I understand. The other thing is Atlas is really informed and influenced where work has been done. So Atlas has the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 BSRs. Tier 1 are the highest priority. And it's going to be a little hard to see on your screen, but what this map shows is that there's a lot of work that's happened in the tier 1 BSRs, as you'd expect. So what this map shows, and it's an accumulation of work by a lot of work at the model watershed. We helped with it a little bit, but it's a summation of the reported implementation or project metrics that have happened since 2015, and then we mapped those by subwatershed/BSR, and this map shows that. There's a memo available ultimately that you could review that documents this work. And one thing we did also is on the BSR level, we tried to look at what's the total potential work that could happen in these BSRs. And we put the amount of work over that potential, so like the denominator. And so if you were to see the details here, you'd see that the units are in percentage. So we attempted to say how much progress have we made over how much could be done. So some goals. We really want to update new science. We want to reduce unnecessary complexity. We're trying to incorporate that progress, and then we want to maintain that collaborative approach and come together and reevaluate what we're doing and try to do it better. So some of the key questions going into this process are, what have we learned? And I think there's some sort of underpinning pieces of Atlas that are really important. We need to have an understanding and really have a conversation about, are there certain life history bottlenecks that we need to be thinking about in the Grand Ronde and Catherine Creek subbasins? Atlas has a bunch of nuts and bolts underneath it, but ultimately we need to have the conversation about what priorities make sense, right? You can easily get into the knobs, but my goal is to have a conversation about those bigger picture questions before we get into the knobs. Atlas has a strong reliance on knowing where fish are and the periodicity of use. We maybe want to update our understanding of limiting factors. So, if you're in the room and you know a lot about these things, you might be thinking, where in the watershed do we know more or have a refined understanding of these things, limiting factors, fish use? And then I think also we want to think about, like, what's the actual work we've been doing and isn't effective for the goals and the challenges that we know exist in the watershed. So just kind of rolling up above the data pieces, I think this is where we get into some of the meaty questions. Are we working in the right places is a fundamental question, and I'll get more into that in a second. How have stream conditions changed? We maybe have just a different understanding of stream conditions. Maybe there's better data sets. We also know we've made a lot of progress, particularly in those tier 1 BSRs. So how does that update the scoring of where we work? And then one big factor that I'll talk a little bit today about is how do we integrate climate change into this framework? So that first question, are we restoring habitat in the right places? And if you look at the map, on the right, this is a map of the tiering of the existing atlas. So the dark blues are tier 1s, the light blues are tier 2s, and the yellows are tier 3s. And I think many of you have seen this map or a similar one. And as you saw in the previous map of kind of where we've done work, we've done a lot of work in those tier 1 BSRs. And so it's an important decision to understand where we're working because the atlas guides where we work. And the other thing you notice about this map is those dark blue watersheds are in the upper watersheds, right? Um, I think the original atlas was founded on this idea that more fish use, as quantified by a greater number of life stages and species, um, were the generally higher priority areas. Which I'm not saying is wrong, but it does prioritize these corresponding and rearing areas, and it deprioritizes migration corridors. We know the lower rivers are places that fish have to use to get to those upper watershed areas. And so I think, um, another way I've thought about that in just my very basic non-fish biologist brain is you might have more life stages using those upper watersheds, but a smaller proportion of the number of fish that come into the basin, right? So we need to be thinking about maybe both. Um, so just to get a little bit into the nuts and bolts about how these BSRs get scored, it basically comes down to four subscores, and you can think of them as ranging from 0 to 1. Two of those address directly fish use and needs, and those are quantified based on the number of life stages using a given BSR and the criticality or the importance of those life stages. So that's the first two lines in this equation. And then we have kind of a condition and potential category. What is the condition of the stream, and what's our potential to affect change in those subwatersheds? Ultimately, those things are summed up, come up to a score of 0 to 100, and those numbers were used to set the tiers. And that's how we got to those upper watershed priorities. It's those fish use ones that, like I said, I got a little ahead of myself. Number of life stages. We're kind of into the weeds here, but number of life stages was the key metric. And we've been thinking about the migration corridor piece. How do we maybe capture the importance of migration corridors? And this is one example, or kind of the example metric that we're thinking about is we quantified by BSR how much mileage of Chinook use is upstream. This gives you an indicator of how many fish have to pass through a given BSR. It's another way to capture those trade-offs between prioritizing migration corridors and upper watersheds. This is basically the same thing, but we weighted those using this FDAT layer, which is this layer that BPA has created, and it's a predictive tool predicting juvenile densities, and we were able to roll that up to the BSR level. And then we weighted those upstream mileages based on where are fish going in the basin, and what's that network structure? How are they distributing? Where are the migration corridors? So I think that's a key issue. There's the metrics, but then there's the conversation, right? And those two need to talk to each other. We ultimately want to capture the conversation of updating Atlas with some simple metrics that aren't overly complex, that can be used and updated into the future. Okay, shifting a little bit, stream conditions. This is one of those ones I mentioned. This is kind of basically a more detail of what I showed, but you can see basically across most of the metrics, or the metrics capturing the work we've done, we've placed a lot of wood in the headwaters of the Upper Grande, Ronde, and Catherine Creek. That's where we've created the most pools. Fish passage work has kind of been distributed. I think there's a big project in Indian Creek. That's that big dark blue on the upper right. Stream miles restored on the left. I think the floodplain acres restored is an interesting one. You don't see a lot of big metrics there, and I don't know if that's a metric confusion reporting issue. We know that metrics are confusing, and I think the model watershed's working on improving some of those. And then riparian acres are also concentrated in those headwaters. We can also look at progress because, of course, we want to know how far we've come and how much work we have remaining. We just said in those tier one BSRs, what's the status of the opportunities? Remember, those are those project level polygons. We said, let's look at the status of those because the model watershed does track. Are they completed, in progress, on hold, or not completed? So we just summed those up. And if you look at Catherine Creek has fewer tier one BSRs than Upper Grand Ronde, and the stream mileage within those BSRs is less in Catherine Creek. But at least according to this data, it shows that Catherine Creek has is closer to kind of working through all of the opportunities. Now, I think that one of the big opportunities that encompasses that 77% is in progress. So it's maybe not completed, but we counted that in the green. And then there's been a lot of progress in the Upper Grand Ronde as well, but there's more work to do up there. And so there's more red, 63% on hold or incomplete. Just another way to look at it. Okay. Climate change. This is a newer component, and climate change is tricky because if we think about how to restore, and we had this actually, I should touch back on that. We had this great session on climate change last State of the Science, and we talked about some of these things. We had a really open conversation, and how you restore watersheds, for knowing that our waters are going to warm, our stream flows are going to get less. And we kind of came back to that framework, fish needs and use. We want to tie to that, and we're thinking about where to restore relative to climate change. And we also want to think about how do we affect change. And so to me, this really comes down to the specific actions that you take, the restoration actions in the watershed. So for example, um, riparian restoration is a good one, right? Riparian restoration is a tool. We can increase stream shading to cool the stream, but we know that that tool must be used in the right places, right? And especially because the benefits of shading propagate downstream. And so that suggests that you should prioritize riparian restoration in the headwaters above where the stream has already warmed, and is impacting salmonids. So we haven't fully fleshed this out, but we have a work in progress where we're really trying to incorporate at a simple but robust level some of those network relationships and understanding what actions actually affect some of these climate change impacts, and then where should we do them to have a real impact on fish. And there's a couple good papers out there. One of them is older, this Beachy 2013 addresses specific actions and the relationship and ability to affect climate change impacts. And then there's a newer one that talks about kind of the where on the landscape you do it. So we're using those pieces. Now this part is the least fleshed out, and so I'm just going to gloss over it, but there is this whole opportunity framework that sits in the second layer of Atlas. And like I said, that's been used a little bit less than the BSR part, but I think it's important. Um, I think there's an opportunity to incorporate project scale in the scoring of opportunities, or at least projects. And so the opportunities that um, the way opportunities are currently scored is they just consider the number of actions that are identified within a given um, project area on the landscape, and we're looking at thinking about scale. And that also brings about an opportunity to integrate project level scoring with the metrics that are reported over the course of a project design. So thinking about those pieces, I know I'm not describing it very well, but that's kind of what we're thinking. So in summary, Atlas is a great opportunity to consolidate our understanding, to update our priorities, obviously, but then also just really come together and understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, where we're doing it, all those key questions. And the process is beginning soon with the TAC. And it has, I won't give all the details, but I have a table on the right. I think uh, the model watershed has tried to cover the gamut of the groups that are doing restoration, both in a scientific space and also an implementation space, for this update process ahead. So that's all I have, and thank you for listening. Any questions? I think we have time. Shoot. Oh, there's good question. Long questions.
Yeah, thanks for this. So a lot of what I'm seeing and hearing is that there's a lot of metrics about kind of the hydrology, geology, biological complex systems. And I'm curious how there's kind of the social aspects of our communities might be incorporated for project success.
Yeah. Um, so, getting back into those nuts and bolts, there are some like feasibility scores that incorporate on that opportunity level, kind of how a project is, I guess it's feasibility, basically the difficulty of completing the project. And then I think there's also this rating factor where the partners decide whether it's full restoration or partial restoration. And I know I'm kind of getting to your question here, but I think that's a way to maybe one way the current framework integrates like, what's how much what's the human role in that process? But maybe I need to ask you like do you have kind of a broader vision or thinking in mind behind your question?
So I do youth engagement in this kind of work and see this work being on really long timescales, right? And so to engage youth and communities, like our ecological complex ecological systems exists within social political systems. And so how do those two systems come together perhaps or have incorporate more of that social political system complexity into the atlas? And I think, the project on Little Creek that got pushed back, I guess is maybe one way to put it, is one example of, case in point. And also because we're working on such long timescales, how are we ensure that the long-term success is folding in youth engagement? So I guess that's always on my mind because of the work that I do. And I don't often see it or hear it in some of these decision-making processes.
Yeah, maybe I agree all those things are important. I would just say that, while I painted Alice as this really cool opportunity to kind of prioritize our work, which I think it is, I think it does still just kind of provide one basic um, outcome, which is we're in, and this connects sociopolitical. We're investing money to recover salmon, and we recognize that in order to do that effectively, we need to prioritize where and what actions we do on the landscape. And it kind of that's the ultimate goal of it. And then along the way, we're trying to build the collaborative piece and understanding among practitioners in that process. But I don't know that it's the tool that's really best suited to engage the public because it is kind of a technical thing. But I don't mean to, anyway, I'd love to talk more about it.
Thanks. If it's okay, I'd like to provide another partial answer to that question.
Thanks.
A couple of years ago, back in 2021, some of the original authors and people who put together the Atlas program published a paper in Fisheries that was basically a 5-year follow up on the Riemann et al. Like, are we making progress in habitat restoration in the Columbia Basin as a whole? And we use the Upper Grand Ronde including the Atlas and the partners out here as an example of what we were doing well and what we were doing mediocre and what we could do a lot better at. And I agree with the question that there was a need identified to do better at that like social ecological interface, but also there was a lot of examples of like landowner incentive programs that are, for flow and for conservation easements, engagement with the tribes. The publication outlines some of those, but we weren't just patting ourselves on the back. We were also trying to recognize where we could do better. And there's a bunch of resources in there. I'd be happy to pass that paper over. So sorry, I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but we did think about that. Yeah.
I guess I have a question. So this Atlas update seems like it's, pretty big and is going to require input from a lot of people. And I know when we're thinking a decade down the road, there might be even another Atlas update. Are there things that you think we should keep in mind now for how best to incorporate these adaptive management lessons learned, or recognizing that what we do now might change and the climate predictions might change down the road?
Um, I think we're going to get into those lessons. I think what I appreciate about Atlas is um, the fact that it does engage the community of practitioners and scientists. I think something I say to myself often on a daily basis is simplicity pays dividends. And I know that's maybe in a group of scientists that doesn't uh, resonate. But what I think is uh, when you have these processes, and it's taken me a while to understand the nuts and bolts of it, and I'm a fairly technical person. So I think one of my goals is to say, like, how can we weed out some of the stuff that's hard to understand? How can we make, especially if it doesn't add a lot of value to the ultimate end goal? And then how do we transfer the knowledge of this this setup, this process to the next 10 years? So we want to document as best as we can. Um, so I guess that's my half baked answer.